Picture this for a second. You walk out onto the back porch, maybe with your coffee still in your hand, and there's that tomato pot you were really hoping would turn the corner by now. The leaves are curled a little at the edges, not dramatic enough to look dead, but not healthy either. Just tired. The kind of tired that makes you feel like you've already failed before the season even got going. And then you look at the soil. It's pulled away from the sides of the pot. The top is pale, crusted over, cracked like an old dinner plate left too long in the sun. You pour water on it, and instead of soaking in, it skates across the surface and runs down the gap at the edges like the soil wants nothing to do with it. Most people in that moment assume the same thing. They think the plant is thirsty, or hungry. Or maybe they think they forgot to fertilize, or didn't fertilize enough, or picked the wrong bag of mix, or maybe the heat was just too much this week. So they do what modern gardening has trained them to do. They go buy something. Another bag, another bottle, another promise. And that right there is the part almost nobody stops to question. How did the thing that is supposed to grow life become so lifeless it won't even accept water? Because once you ask that question, really ask it, you start seeing the whole garden center a little differently. You start realizing that what looks like a simple container problem is actually the visible edge of something much bigger and a lot older. A mistake that got normalized so completely that most home gardeners never even learn to recognize it as a mistake. What you are looking at in that pot is not just dry soil. You are looking at a biological system that has been emptied out. And the uncomfortable part is, a lot of what gets sold to fix that problem is part of what created it. Walk into a big box garden center on a Saturday morning and you can feel the confidence of the place almost immediately. Stacks of bright bags, potting mix, raised bed mix, moisture control blends, organic blends, premium blends, professional blends, everything clean, everything labeled, everything made to look reliable. There's a strange kind of comfort in that setup. It makes gardening feel manageable. Like all the uncertainty of nature has been packed down into something tidy, sanitized, and ready for checkout. But that neatness comes with a cost. A lot of commercial bagged mixes are built to be uniform, shelf-stable, weed-free, and safe to sell at scale. From a retail perspective, that makes perfect sense. Nobody wants to buy a bag full of weed seeds, pests, fungus gnats, or something unpredictable. So the material gets processed hard, heated, treated, standardized, cleaned up until it behaves the same way from bag to bag. And sure, that kills the bad actors. It also kills the good ones. That's the part the label doesn't really linger on. Because soil is not just a brown substance that holds roots upright. Healthy soil is a living economy. It is busy all the time. Even when the surface looks still, even when the garden is quiet, even when you think nothing is happening, there is an entire underground exchange running beneath your feet. Bacteria are cycling nutrients. Fungi are extending the reach of roots. Tiny organisms are breaking things down, gluing particles together, opening pathways for air and water, changing minerals into forms plants can actually use. A living soil is not a storage bin. It is a workforce. And when that workforce is gone, the plant does not step into the gap and solve the problem by itself. It can't. Plants were never designed to do that. In the wild, roots do not operate alone. They leak sugars into the soil to feed microbes, and those microbes return the favor by unlocking phosphorus, iron, zinc, nitrogen, and a whole cascade of things the plant cannot just reach out and grab on its own. That partnership is ancient, older than lawns, older than fertilizers in plastic jugs, older than garden centers and weekend shopping carts and every glossy feeds for 6 months claim printed on a bag. So when a gardener fills a pot with a mix that looks clean and professional but has very little living biology left in it, the plant enters that container alone. No partners, no underground help, no functioning food web, just roots in a medium. And for a little while, that can be hidden. That's what makes this so deceptive. You can still get an early flush of growth, especially if the mix comes preloaded with fertilizer, or if you start adding bottled feed on top of it. The leaves green up, the stems push. The plant responds fast enough to make it all look like success, but fast response and real soil health are not the same thing. They just aren't. A plant can be propped up for quite a while in a weak root zone. A lot of gardeners have seen this without having the language for it. The tomato looks impressive in May, maybe even early June, and then all at once the energy drops out of it. Watering becomes weird. The surface crust. The pot gets heavy and dry at the same time somehow. The roots stop exploring. The leaves start telling on the soil long before the gardener knows how to read what they're saying. And because the whole system underneath is underbuilt, the usual answer becomes more input from above, more feed, more correction, more rescue. This is where people get quietly trapped, not because they are careless, Not because they're bad gardeners. Mostly because nobody explains the structure of the trap in the first place. Once the biological life of soil is stripped back far enough, synthetic feeding starts to feel necessary, and in the short term it works just well enough to keep the cycle going. That is how dependence gets built, not through one dramatic failure. Through a series of little temporary saves. You add fertilizer, the plant perks up. You buy potting mix, the bed looks refreshed. You grab bloom booster, the label gives you hope. You keep going because each step offers a small visible reward. But under the surface, something else can be happening. The chemistry may keep the top growth moving while the structure of the soil body itself gets worse. Microbial communities thin out. The particles lose the biological glues that help them hold a soft crumb. Compaction creeps in. Air spaces collapse. Water behavior gets strange. What should soak in starts to bead up or race around the root ball instead of through it. That hard water-repelling pot on the porch didn't become that way overnight. It got there by degrees. A little less life, a little less structure, a little more dependence, a few more store-bought corrections. And once you see it that way, the whole thing stops looking like a random garden mishap and starts looking more like a pattern. Now, to be fair, synthetic fertilizer did not appear in human history because somebody wanted to ruin container gardens. That's not the story. The modern fertilizer era came out of a real scientific breakthrough, and one that mattered enormously. Pulling nitrogen from the air and turning it into usable fertilizer changed food production on a global scale. It helped feed a world that would have struggled to feed itself otherwise. So this is not one of those cartoon stories where everything modern is evil and everything old was perfect. That's too easy, and it's not true. The deeper problem is what happened next. A tool that can be incredibly powerful in one context slowly became the default answer in too many others, including home gardening, where the condition of the soil itself often needed attention more than the plant needed another chemical push. And that push can be deceptive, because when mineral salts hit a struggling plant, the response is often quick. Leaves can green up fast, growth can surge. To the gardener, especially a tired one, that feels reassuring. It feels like proof. Finally, something is working. But quick growth is not always resilient growth. Sometimes it's just urgency. Sometimes the plant is getting fed in a way that bypasses the deeper problem for another week or two, while the underlying soil body keeps getting thinner, harsher, more compacted, and less able to regulate water and nutrients on its own. That is why so many people end up with the same experience year after year. Fresh bagged mix at the start of the season. Bottled feeding once things stall. More watering as the heat comes on. Then that familiar late-season slump where everything feels strangely brittle and exhausted, even though money and effort have both been poured into it. At a certain point you have to ask, what exactly are we maintaining here? A plant or a purchase cycle? Because the home gardener standing in line with a cart full of bagged mix and liquid fertilizer every spring is participating in a smaller version of the same logic that shaped industrial agriculture. Remove biological complexity, replace it with purchased inputs, and then normalize the dependency that follows. And the thing that gets lost in all of that is not just money, it's understanding. People start forgetting what healthy soil even looks like, or smells like, or feels like in the hand. Healthy soil does not have that dead papery feel to it. It does not sit there like dust-bound sponge cake refusing water. It has give, it has texture. It breaks apart into crumbs instead of plates. It smells faintly sweet and earthy, not stale. Water enters it without drama. Roots move through it like they've been invited. And maybe most importantly, healthy soil does not act alone. It hosts life so well that the plant is never handling the entire burden by itself. That brings us to one of the simplest and clearest indicators of whether a soil is really alive: worms. Not as a cute gardening symbol, not as a children's book version of nature, as a real functional sign that the underground economy is still operating. Charles Darwin, near the end of his life, spent years studying earthworms, not casually either. He watched them closely, measured their activity, paid attention to what they were doing to the ground beneath ordinary gardens and fields, and what he saw was not a minor side note of nature. It was a massive hidden process. Worms were not just hanging around in healthy soil. They were making it. They were digesting decaying material, pulling it downward, aerating the ground, creating passageways for water, and leaving behind castings far richer than the surrounding earth. In other words, they were doing the kind of slow, patient engineering that no bagged amendment can fake. Darwin understood something modern gardeners are rarely taught to notice. If worms are thriving, the soil is not just present, it is functioning. And once that clicks, another question becomes hard to ignore. When was the last time you found a big healthy earthworm in a store-bought potting mix? Not in the compost pile. Not under an old board in the yard. In the actual bagged mix. Usually the answer is never. And that makes sense because worms are not eating dirt for the sake of dirt. They are feeding in a living environment. They are following biology. They go where the food web is active, where moisture and organic matter and microbial life are doing their thing. Take that life away, make the medium too sterile, too acidic, too harsh, too empty, and worms don't settle there. There's no reason to. They leave. Or they never come. Which means when worms disappear, they are not just absent. They are telling you something. They are telling you the underground kitchen is closed. And once that kitchen closes, the whole system above it starts leaning on outside, feeding more and more heavily just to keep appearances up. That's why this is bigger than a tomato pot. Bigger than one bad bag of mix. Bigger than one season where your peppers stalled out or your herbs got leggy and weird. What's really been forgotten here is the old baseline truth that soil is supposed to be alive first and useful second, not the other way around. Modern retail gardening tends to reverse that order. It asks the soil to be convenient, uniform, predictable, clean-looking, easy to stack on a pallet, easy to print claims on. Life does not always fit neatly into that business model. And that is exactly why living soil so often gets reduced to the part that can be sold most easily, while the actual biological complexity that makes it work gets treated like background detail. But that background detail is the whole story. Because once the life goes missing, everything else becomes maintenance. And now we get to the hopeful turn in all of this. The answer is not to attack your plants with something stronger, not to keep escalating the dose, not to treat dead soil like a lazy employee that needs more pressure from management. Dead soil does not need more force. It needs its workforce back. That's the rediscovery hiding underneath the whole problem. The thing that should probably have stayed obvious but didn't. If the soil has gone flat, compacted, inert, sour, and water-repellent, the real comeback starts by rebuilding the invisible labor that used to keep it open, fed, and alive. And the beautiful part is, once you understand that, the fix starts looking very different from the usual shopping trip. Because the first step toward waking that soil back up does not begin in the fertilizer aisle. It begins with life. Small life. The kind most people never see. And the strange, almost funny twist here is that some of the organisms capable of helping bring dead soil back online are already familiar to us. We've lived with them for ages. We've trusted them in food long before most people ever heard the word microbe in a positive context. So in part 2, that's where we go next. Not to another product. Not to another glossy promise. To the kitchen. To rice water. To molasses. To ash. To a living brew that doesn't feed the plant in the usual top-down way, but helps reintroduce the underground workforce the soil has been missing. And once that workforce comes back, even a tired old pot on a porch can start behaving like soil again. When you're ready, I'll write part 2 in the same voice.